The dust came before the wind did. It rose from the flat Oklahoma earth like something that had been waiting underground for years, patient and heavy, and it moved across the territory in long, rolling sheets that turned the afternoon sun the color of a dying fire. A man on horseback came through it, slowly, the way only a man with no particular destination moves, not hurried, not lost, simply present in the motion itself, letting the miles pass beneath him the way water passes beneath a bridge that has long since stopped counting. His name was Elias Cole. He was 53 years old. He had a gray mare named November, a bedroll worn thin from a decade of hard ground, and the silence about him so complete that even the dust seemed to move around him with a kind of respect. He had ridden for the Union during the war. He had come back from it the way many men came back, technically whole, visibly present, and inwardly rearranged in ways that no one around him had the language to understand. The West had suited him after that. Not because it was beautiful, though sometimes it was, but because it was vast enough to give a man room to carry what he carried, without it pressing too hard against the people nearest him. He had learned in the years since the war that the kindest thing he could offer the world was distance. He believed that completely. He had built his entire life around that belief, and he had been writing on that belief for 9 years without once stopping long enough to question whether it was true or whether it was simply the most comfortable lie a broken man could tell himself. He was not supposed to stop in Grover's Crossing. He had not planned it. November had developed a slight tenderness in her left foreleg somewhere in the 20 miles before the settlement appeared on the horizon, and a man who loved his horse the way Elias loved November did not argue with that kind of signal. He came into town at a slow walk past the leaning church and the general store with its faded awning, past 2 old men on a bench who watched him the way men in small towns watch strangers, with curiosity wearing the mask of indifference. And he stopped at the water trough beside the livery because that was where a man stopped when his horse needed rest. He was loosening November's saddle cinch when he saw her. She was tucked against the side of the trough, small enough that the shadow of the post beside her nearly swallowed her entirely. A child, a girl perhaps, 7 or 8 years old, with bare feet flat against a cracked earth and dark tangled hair falling across the side of her face. She was not crying. She was not fidgeting the way children fidget. She was perfectly unnaturally still, with her arms wrapped around her own knees and her eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing in it. And something in that stillness reached across the space between them and laid its hand flat against Elias Cole's chest before he had taken a single step toward her. He had seen that stillness before, not in children, in men who had survived things they were not supposed to survive. It was the stillness that came after the body had finished being afraid and had simply accepted the shape of the world as it was. It was not peace, it was the exhausted twin of peace, the thing that wore peace's face when peace itself was not available. He crouched down slowly, keeping distance, keeping his voice at the level of something that did not want to startle. "Hey there," he said. "You all right?" She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were dark and careful and entirely too old for the faith they lived in. She studied him the way a person studies a door they are not sure is safe to open. Then she said, "Yes, sir." 2 words, perfectly flat, perfectly rehearsed. It was then that he saw her face fully. The left side of it, just below the cheekbone, had gone the deep purple yellow of a bruise that was several days old and had not been the first of its kind. He felt something move through him that was not quite anger yet. It was the thing that lives just beneath anger, the hot and wordless recognition of something that should not be. "Who did this to you?" he asked. He kept his voice even. He kept it gentle. He asked it the way you ask a question when you already know the answer will cost you something. The girl looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved her hair. Somewhere behind them, a horse shifted its weight and stamped once against the dry ground. And then she said, in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever, the way a voice carries no emotion when emotion has been made too dangerous to show, "My father, sir." Elias Cole did not move. He let those words arrive and settle and spread through him the way cold water spreads through a man who has been holding his breath. He had heard confessions on battlefields. He had heard men speak of things that could not be spoken in the daylight hours. But there was something particular about the absence of hope in a child's voice, the way she said it not as an accusation or a plea, but as a plain fact of her world. The way she might say the sky is gray or the water is cold, that reached past every hard thing life had built around his heart and found the unguarded place underneath. "What's your name, Clara?" She said, "Clara." "Where's your mama, Clara?" A pause. Then, "She passed, winter before last." "And your daddy, where is he right now?" Her eyes moved briefly toward the far end of the street, toward a building with a hitching post out front and the low sound of men's voices drifting through the afternoon air. She didn't need to say anything more. Elias followed her gaze and understood. He sat down on the ground beside her. This trail-worn, war-scarred 53-year-old cowboy in his dusty coats and broken-in boots simply sat down on the cracked earth next to a barefoot child because it was the only honest thing he could think to do. He sat there and he listened, asking questions softly and waiting for answers with the patience of a man who had learned that truth came in its own time and could not be rushed without breaking. He learned about Agnes Plum, Clara's grandmother, who lived on the edge of town and who had been fighting quietly and unsuccessfully for 2 years to bring Clara home to her. He learned about the sheriff, who owed Holt Traven money and had a talent for looking away. He learned about a town that knew everything and had agreed, through the slow, collective cowardice of people who value their own comfort over a child's safety, to know nothing. He found Agnes Plum's house before sundown. She answered the door with the caution of a woman who had been disappointed by arrivals before, and she looked at him, this stranger on her step with trail dust still on his shoulders, the way you look at something you cannot yet determine is help or another form of harm. He told her his name. He told her what he had seen, and something in her face, which had been carefully composed against hope for a very long time, shifted almost imperceptibly, like a curtain moving in a room where there should be no wind. "I have tried every door in this town," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands, wrapped around the edge of the doorframe, were not. "The sheriff, the circuit judge when he came through, the men at the church. Every one of them has a reason. Every reason is a fear with a better coat on. Clara is still in that house. She is still coming home to what she comes home to. And I am old, sir, and I am tired, and I'm running out of ways to fight something this heavy with hands this small. You haven't lost yet, not while she's still breathing, and you're still standing at this door." That night, in the small room he took above the livery, Elias lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. He thought about writing on. He listed every reason it made sense. He had no authority here, no connections, no claim on any of it. He was a stranger passing through. There were men in this town whose job it was to handle things like this, and if those men had chosen not to do their jobs, what exactly was one trail-worn cowboy supposed to do about it? He lay there and he built the argument for leaving, brick by careful brick. And when he had finished building it, he lay inside it for a long time. And then slowly, another face came to him in the dark. Not Clara's face, a different one. A girl of 17 now, if his arithmetic was right, living in Missouri with her mother, who had spent her childhood watching the road for a father who kept not coming back. Her name was Ruth. She had been 8 years old the last time he had seen her. He had left because he told himself he was too damaged from the war to be the father she deserved. He had told himself that his absence was an act of love, that a broken man who stayed might do more harm than a broken man who went. He had believed that. He had needed to believe it. But lying in that small room above delivery with Clara's voice still moving through his mind, "My father, sir," the belief collapsed quietly and completely, like a wall that has been undermined for years finally giving way all at once. He understood in the particular honesty of that sleepless night that there was more than one way to fail a child. Holt Draven failed his daughter with his hands. Elias Cole had failed his with his boots, always pointed towards a horizon, always finding a reason the next town over was where he needed to be. The distance between those two failures, which he had always needed to believe was vast, revealed itself in the dark to be far smaller than he could comfortably live with. He did not leave in the morning. Instead, he went first to the sheriff, a broad man named Caswell with careful eyes and a badge that had lost its shine, and he sat across from him in the small office that smelled of tobacco and avoidance, and he spoke plainly. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He simply described what he had seen and named what it was, and told the sheriff that a man in his position had a choice that would define the remainder of his time in that office and possibly the remainder of his life. Caswell looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the desk. Then he said that it was complicated. Elias said that it wasn't. He said that what was complicated was the web of debts and fears that had grown up around something that was actually very simple, and that simple things had a way of becoming very public when they had been buried too long. He spent the following day speaking to men individually, at the livery, outside the general store, on the road between town and the outer farms. He did not gather crowds. He did not make speeches. He spoke to each one quietly, personally, and he asked each one the same question in different forms. What would you want done if this were your grandchild? Some men turned away, but some did not. And the ones who did not began speaking to each other, which was the precise thing that Holt-Draven had always counted on not happening, because Holt-Draven's power had never been force alone. It had been the silence that force creates. And silence, Elias had learned in the war, was only as strong as the agreement that maintained it. When enough men withdrew from that agreement, the silence fell apart. On the 8th day, Holt-Draven himself came looking for Elias. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that might once have been handsome and had since become something harder and less legible. He found Elias at the water trough where it had all begun. As though the confrontation had a sense of geography, he stood close, the way men stand when they want size to function as argument. "I hear you'd been asking questions about my family," he said. His voice was low and controlled. "I'd encourage you to mind your own affairs and move along." Elias looked at him steadily. He had stood in front of men far more dangerous than Holt-Draven, on fields far more consequential than this one. He was not afraid. He was something quieter than afraid, and something more dangerous than angry. "I've seen your daughter," he said. "I've seen what you've put on her face. And I've talked to enough men in this town to know that your name doesn't carry the weight you think it does anymore. Not with what people now know they'll be asked to answer for by God and by each other." Something moved through Holt-Draven's face then. Not remorse, not yet, perhaps not ever, but something. The particular expression of a man who has depended on a structure for years and has just felt it shift beneath his feet. He stood there for a moment longer, holding his ground out of habit. Then he turned and walked away. And the way he walked had something diminished in it that had not been there when he arrived. 3 days later, the sheriff came to Holt-Draven's door with 2 other men and a document, and Clara walked out of that house in the early morning with nothing but what she was wearing, and the particular expression of someone who does not yet trust that what is happening is real. Agnes Plum was at her gate. She had been standing there since before dawn, the way people stand when they have waited so long for something that they cannot risk not being ready. When Clara came through that gate, the old woman went down to her knees in the dirt, not in weakness, but in the involuntary way the body responds to relief so great it cannot be contained upright. And she held her granddaughter with the grip of someone who has been reaching across a long darkness and has finally felt solid ground. Clara did not cry immediately. She stood inside those arms with a kind of stunned stillness, as though her body was trying to verify that this was true, that this was real, that this was actually happening to her and not to someone else. And then, slowly, her small hands came up and gripped the back of her grandmother's dress, and she held on. Elias watched from across the road. He always watched from across the road. It was where men like him ended up, present at the moments that mattered, but slightly outside them, as though participation was something they had to learn how to believe they deserved. He stayed through November. He helped Agnes with firewood and fence repairs, and the small, enduring work of winter preparation. He sat with Clara in the afternoons and said nothing in particular, and let the silence between them be the comfortable kind, which was new to her, and which she approached with the cautious interest of someone discovering that silence did not always mean danger. One afternoon, she asked him why he had stopped. Why him out of all the men who had ridden through? He thought about it honestly before he answered. "Because I almost didn't," he said, "and I've spent enough of my life almost doing the right thing." She looked at him with those dark, ancient eyes. "Are you going to keep almost doing it?" He was quiet for a long time. "No," he said, "I don't think I am." On the first morning of December, he saddled November in the gray pre-dawn cold and rode east. Not west, which had always been his direction, the direction of open land and no questions. East, toward Missouri, toward a girl of 17 who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and who had grown up with an empty space in her life shaped exactly like him. He did not know how she would receive him. He did not let himself imagine a welcome he had not yet earned. He only knew that he was done building comfortable structures out of the lie that leaving was the same as protecting. He was done letting silence stand for peace. He was done riding past. Some men take a whole lifetime to learn how to stop. And some, if the world is still merciful, if grace still moves in the small and ordinary places, get one more chance to stop before it is too late. A barefoot child beside a water trough in Grover's Crossing, Oklahoma Territory, in the autumn of 1857 had done what 9 years of open road had failed to do. She had shown a man his own reflection clearly enough that he could no longer choose not to see it. And what he did with that seeing, the road he turned toward, the door he was willing to knock on, the silence he was finally willing to break, was the truest thing about him. Not what he had done wrong, but what he chose to do next. That is always the truest thing about any of us. If this story found something in you, if it reached the part of you that still believes in second chances and quiet courage, and the kind of love that shows up late but shows up, then Desert Heart was made for you. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell, because every week we bring you stories from the American past that speak directly to the American heart. Stories of real people, real choices, and the moments that proved what a person was truly made of. This community is for those who feel deeply and remember well. We are glad you are here. The educational and human value within this story reaches across several timeless and important truths. It illustrates that community silence around known injustice is not neutrality, it is participation, and history has asked every generation to reckon with that fact. It shows that personal courage is rarely dramatic in its beginning. It often starts with one person simply refusing to walk away from what they have seen. It demonstrates the lasting damage that emotional abandonment causes to children, establishing that absence can be its own form of harm, even when violence is not present. It honors the resilience and dignity of elderly caregivers, people like Agnes Plum, who carry enormous moral weight in their communities without recognition or relief. And it reminds us, perhaps most importantly, that it is never too late to choose differently. Not to undo the past, but to refuse to let the past write the rest of the story. These are not only the values of 1857, they're the values we are still being asked to live up to today.